Right. Hello. So have you been hearing all of our conversation up here? Oh, too bad. I think we'll get things started, even though Gareth Evans is still on his way, and so is Hajim Alhasani, who is the president of the Iraqi National Assembly. We have a very distinguished, articulate, and interesting panel today. Ah, there's Gareth here. To talk about Islam's challenge to eradicate extremism. And I think some people have probably already had trouble with the name of this panel, and also with the little rubric in the book, the Davos book, that put this under the special category of Islamic terrorism. I'm not sure that anybody on this panel would agree with the concept of a special sort of Islamic terrorism, but the people that we have here today are Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, who is the founder and chairman of the Cordoba initiative and a great bridge builder in the United States and elsewhere between Muslims and people of other faiths. We have Abdullah, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan, and I'm sure is well known to many of you already. We will have Hajim Alhasani, who, as I said, is the president of the Iraqi National Assembly. Gareth Evans, who's the president of the International Crisis Group, who will be challenging some of our statements and assumptions up here. His Royal Highness Prince Turki Faisal, who among many other things is now the ambassador to Washington for Saudi Arabia. Iqbal Sakrani, who's the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. And me, Christopher Dickey. I'm with Newsweek magazine, and I'm not supposed to express a lot of my own opinions, but probably will in the course of this discussion. This is going to be a very informal session, I hope. There are no opening remarks as such. We will, I hope, get a kind of a dialogue going here on stage, and then open things up fairly quickly to the audience. And I'm sure there will be a lot of comments and questions from the audience. I would hope that people in the audience would actually make brief comments and make brief questions and not extended statements from the floor, because then I have to get very unpleasant and everybody feels bad about the whole thing. But I really am not going to let people go on for 3, 4, 10, 15 minutes telling us what they think from the floor. Please do engage the panel rather than just making statements on your own. So, with that as our point of departure, I'd like to start with Abdullah, the Foreign Minister of Afghanistan, and ask you if you think Islam does have a special problem with extremism. Obviously, in Afghanistan, you had the whole issue of the Taliban, the existence of the Taliban. It was a long, difficult fight that eventually required outside assistance to get rid of the Taliban. Is that about Islam, or is that about Afghanistan? Is it about extremism, or are there other issues that came to play?
No, I think it is about extremism, and it's not a specific characteristic in Islam. It's extremism altogether. For example, if you take Afghanistan, absolute majority of Afghans are Muslims, and they have been Muslims for centuries. It was tolerant Muslims who lived at peace within themselves and with the others. Yes, of course, in the course of our history, we were invaded, we were colonized, we had to fight. Afghanistan was occupied later on by the Soviet Union, we had to resist. But absolute majority of Afghans were moderate, peaceful, tolerant Muslims, while then, as a result of the jihad in Afghanistan and the events surrounding Afghanistan, a tiny group of people acted against the interest of Afghanistan and Muslims in Afghanistan to begin with. And they gave so many bad names to Muslims because their events, if you look at it, there is that extremism, and then there is Islamophobia, which is another sad reality. So they give a lot of ammunition to those who wanted to target Islam under what Taliban have been doing, or to the innocent people around the world that they didn't have a deep perception or understanding of Islam as a faith, as a religion of over 1 billion people. So it's nothing to do with Islam itself. It's a phenomena utilized by a tiny group of people. And then we suffered before September 11th in Afghanistan. It was in Afghanistan where thousands of people were massacred by these terrorist and extremist elements, Muslims in Afghanistan. I mentioned at least 13th century. For 13th century, Afghans have been Muslims. Buddha statues were there, but it was only during that reign of extremism that it was targeted. So I don't agree with the, of course, with the title earlier, Islamic terrorism. I'm absolutely against it. As a Muslim, born Muslim and practicing Muslim, I cannot agree with such titles. But when it comes to the phenomena itself, it is extremism, and you have extremism all over the world.
Thank you very much. Your Highness, Prince Turki, you were educated by the Jesuits at Georgetown University.
Does it show?
Actually, sometimes it does. And you are part of the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Your father was the king of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is often blamed by many people in the rest of the world for promoting a very extremist kind of Islam that people try to relate to terrorism. How do you answer those kinds of accusations? And please don't be Jesuitical about it.
We Muslims have to recognize that particularly in today's world, most of the violent acts undertaken by terrorists are undertaken by those who claim to be Muslims and by those who claim to be protecting or advancing the cause or in one way or another safeguarding Muslim interests. And it is from that perspective, I think, that Saudi Arabia has undertaken a program of de-Islamizing, if you like, the terrorism that has taken place in the last few years. And that is by taking on and head on the ideological outlook of these people and explaining and engaging and in many cases following security and police work to arrest or to remove from the scene or to prevent terrorist acts. So it is a big problem for all of us Muslims, and we have to deal with it in a global way. These terrorists have been using Islam as a means of not only recruiting support, whether financial or otherwise, but also in trying to show themselves as the spokesman for and the vanguard, if you like, for an Islamic ummah that is, from their interpretation, cowering under the oppression of either the so-called West or, and this is also from their interpretation, illegal and illegitimate Muslim governments. So their battle is against us all, and we have to combat them as in a comprehensive and global way as they combat us. And it is from that, as I said, perspective that the kingdom is dealing with this issue. There are those, correctly as you say, who accuse Saudi Arabia of having, if you like, initiated or promoted or in some way or another is to blame for these people. I would remind these people that the Saudi Arabia, if you like, when it comes to the particular cult of Bin Laden, was the first victim of that cult and not its promoter. The ideology of Bin Laden and his cult coalesced and was invented and promoted, if I may refer to what my colleague, the Minister Abdullah said, on the hills of Afghanistan and not the deserts of Saudi Arabia. And this was a combination of ideas and so on that came from various parts of the world, including, if I may say, from a place like London, where the hospitality given by the British government to a few individuals who promoted this kind of hateful ideology in emanating out of London spread wide among practitioners of this idea, not just in the Arab world, but throughout the Muslim world. So it is a comprehensive issue, and I think blaming one country or one individual or a group of countries, or as the minister said, blaming Islam for it, I think is not only unfair, but it is mistaken.
Thank you very much, Your Highness. Faisal, you live in the United States. Yes. We are looking now at a world in which there are more and more Muslims living in the West, as we say. Iqbal is based in Britain. We're very public relations conscious in the United States. A lot of what we say or think or imagine about Islam is based on publicity, newspaper articles, casual but rare encounters with Muslims. Do you see a major PR problem here for Islam with extremism, and how much do you think that is self-inflicted?
We do. You're very correct, Chris. This is a major issue and a major problem. In fact, a major part of our work at the Cordoba Initiative is to help people understand how perceptions are created both in the West and in the Muslim world. The perceptions that amplify not only the language of extremism, but also that leads to acts done in that fashion. For instance, the very use of the language Islamic terrorism or Islamic terrorists was something which for a very long time caused the Muslim community deep pain. But the use of such language that created links in the reader's mind between religion of Islam and terrorism did a lot to not only create hostility in the Muslim world, but also create the reality. In fact, the very language of clash of civilizations, for instance, actually contributed to the actual clash itself. A year and a half ago, I was in Australia. A young Muslim man presented me a booklet, 2 booklets, published in Britain, called The Inevitability of the Clash of Civilizations. And the basic theme, quoting Quran and Hadith, I'm paraphrasing here, the West is out to get us, so before they get us for lunch, let's have them for breakfast. And the same thing happens.
Which hadith is that from?
Well, I mean, various, prepare for those who are against you, and so on and so forth, which is a very easy thing. Again, the article that appeared, for example, in the Global Agenda magazine calling on boycott of Israel, which distressed a lot of our attendees here, conveys a message that really sets back our efforts and the efforts of many of us, including the Council of 100 of World Economic Forum, who are working very hard to heal this growing divide between the Islamic world and the West and other faith traditions. So therefore, we have always been urging that if we are going to achieve a reconciliation between the West and the Islamic world, we have to restrain ourselves from using condemnatory language, because the language of confrontation, condemnation doesn't go that far. Now, having said this, I'd like to say a comment, Chris, about the definition of terrorism. The military historian, the American military historian Caleb Carr, in his excellent book called The Lessons of Terror, defines terrorism as the targeting of civilian non-combatants in order to achieve specific political objectives. And he points out that every country in the world has done this from the time of the Romans. And in fact, he, segueing very quickly, Robert McNamara, in his documentary, The Fog of War, talks about his own participation during World War II as part of a machinery that firebombed over 60 Japanese cities before the atom bomb of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which really was doing the same, having the same objective, and admitting that, and quoting General Curtis LeMay, saying that had the United States lost the war, they would have been tried as war criminals. So we're dealing with perceptions here, Chris, on both sides. And the perception in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, is that Western states have engaged in this definition of terrorism, that the desire to have or to achieve certain political objectives has made them allow or made them not feel troubled by the loss of innocent Muslim lives, calling it, damage collateral to their political objectives. For example, the statement by Madeleine Albright, which she has officially apologized for when she was asked about the loss of 1 million lives because as a result of the US-led sanctions against Iraq, and saying that it was, tantamount. It was an unfortunate but necessary part of what had to happen. So it's these types of statements that magnify perceptions in the Arab and Muslim world that Western states do not care about the loss of innocent Muslim lives. Most recently, last week or the week before last in Pakistan, where the United States, in an attempt to get Ayman al-Zawahiri, resulted in 18 Muslim innocent lives being lost. Now, in conjunction with that, there is great frustration in the Arab and Muslim world over the Arab states and Muslim states as not having been able to combat or to represent the Muslim cause vis-a-vis the West. Therefore, there's a growing perception, for example, in the Muslim world and in the Arab world, how is it possible for a country like Pakistan, which is a nuclear power, to allow such an invasion of its national territory? This perception at the grassroots level is creating a lot of growing sentiment. And the frustration of the Arab and Muslim world has resulted, therefore, in non-state actors in the Arab and Muslim world engaging in terrorism. So if we want to eliminate terrorism, we have to give it a neutral definition and hold everyone, state actors and non-state actors, to the same set of definitions. And this is where I think the global world community needs to focus on this issue. When the United Nations tried to attain and to achieve a definition of terrorism way back before 9/11, it failed in doing this. And I think that the failure of achieving this contributes to framing the ideational dynamics which allows for extremism to occur. And it's only a matter of course before it has happened in the name of Islam.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome Hajim Alhasani, who's the president of the Iraqi National Assembly. And I also wanted to say that I think the question of terrorism got a hell of a lot more complicated today with the election results in Palestine, where, as most of you probably have heard, Hamas has won an absolute majority in the Legislative Council. So we will all be trying to figure out whether Hamas is a terrorist organization or a democratic organization, or both, or whether we should all be redefining our concepts of those words. Iqbal, in Europe, we have seen the growth of kind of radicalism that I think people, even during the most difficult earlier days of immigration in Europe, did not anticipate. Certainly the London bombings shocked people terribly, the Madrid bombings, the unrest in the banlieue of Paris. All of that is related to issues of immigration and integration, certainly. But the violence in the London bombings and in Madrid was claimed by people in the name of Islam. Where do you see the essential problems in terms of European Muslims? Are they problems of integration? Are they problems of Islam? Or are those inseparable problems?
I think the main issue is to really make it very clear at the outset that Islam is not a problem. When we are talking about extremism or terrorism, it has absolutely no links whatsoever. And this factual understanding has to really come in and has to be understood by the communities. Whether it is in sort of titles of programs, which are perhaps put in inadvertently, the damage it causes is enormous. Because Islam, a religion which is the middle path, and therefore by definition, it comes out of any extreme elements. And the Arabic word of Ummat al-Wasatan makes it very clear. It's the mainstream religion. Now, there are elements, there are individuals and organizations, as we heard from the earlier panelist, who are pursuing their particular political objectives And they would want to use the word Islam in terms of pursuit for justice and trying to fight occupation, trying to fight oppression. But then every faith believes in issues of justice, fighting occupation, fighting suppression, understanding, mutual understanding, tolerance. These are issues which all of us, irrespective of which faith we come from. Therefore, when this tragedy struck in London, of course, we were all utterly stunned and shocked. But the life was made much easier by the initial statements made by the police commissioner and then by the Prime Minister, who made it absolutely clear. Here we are dealing with the issue of criminality. It's an issue that we have had this tragic incident that has taken place, but it should not be in any way construed or linked with the Islam or with the Muslim community. Now, of course, that saved that major backlash that we would have had. And I think this was duly recognized by the European Monitoring Service and the statement by the European Commission as well, that all the stakeholders, the police, the government, the Muslim community, made their position absolutely clear that as far as the attack that took place was an act of criminality, and we had to condemn it utterly and totally without any reservation. But it's also important for us to here distinguish between what happened in 9/11 in the States, where that was treated as war on terror. War against what? You see? So here, the London episode and the 9/11, as much as the tragic consequences that took place, were very clear, but they were defined in a different area. But we must also understand that who were the real victims of 7/7? Yes, the few hundred people that died in London, the families who suffered the loss of their innocent loved ones. But then we had the 2 million Muslims who were the victims of the tragedy as well. And we were saved from the total denigration, where the entire community were to be criminalized in the media because of that earlier statement that had come in. And we had asked the government that, look, we want to really go into some depth to find out where is these elements, these criminals who came out within the Muslim community. So yes, you can have extreme elements, you can have criminal elements within the Muslim community, but it has nothing to do with Islam. The teaching of Islam condemns the very acts that have been perpetrated by these people. And therefore we felt that it was important for the government to establish an independent public inquiry that would help all of us to identify and to go into some detail as to what motivated these elements, where was this linkage coming from, where were they connected, that enabled them to carry out this criminal act. But sadly, the government has not agreed to that. But we will be concerned because I think we want to prevent future tragedies. And unless we know the background of it, we will not be able to stop that in future.
President Alhasani, you are participating in one of the greatest experiments in social engineering in modern history as Iraq tries to raise itself from the devastation of the Saddam Hussein dictatorship and the American invasion and the difficulties that have followed under occupation. Islam figures large in the efforts to create a modern Iraqi state. And I think a lot of people, some inside Iraq and many, many outside Iraq, are wondering if the direction of the Iraqi government now is toward what we would see as a modern state easily integrated into the world community, or whether it is toward some kind of religious state that will be more problematic for Europe and the United States over the long run. Could you give us your thoughts on that?
Well,
I think you need to take your microphone a bit closer.
That probably brings us, to the same issue of Hamas that you talked about it. I think there should be rules and principles for the democracy, and at the end, everybody should abide by these rules. Religious parties like Hamas or religious parties in Iraq who won the elections, they came through the democracy process that we are talking about. That at the end, we have to abide by that. I don't see any problem with that thing. I think it's about time, for these religious movements and parties to be part of the political process. The origin of terrorism comes from isolating these movements and these Islamic parties from the rest of the society. If anybody remembers that the issue of takfir came from Egypt, when Nasser imprisoned the brotherhoods, Muslim brotherhoods in Egypt, and through that imprisonment came the theory and ideology of what we are seeing today. And there are other things that contributed to the situation, whether it's in Iraq or in other places. The Mujahideen of Afghan Mujahideen, Arab Afghan Mujahideen, or today they are called Al-Qaeda. These are the byproduct of the American-Soviet war, and at the end, nobody knew what to do with these people, and these people ended up at in Iraq and other places and created problems for these states. So I think to tackle the issue of terrorism, you need to go back to the origin, how this terrorist ideology was created. And to win the strategy against terrorism, I think it's very simple. I call it win strategy. You need to win the good people, get them to be part of the political process, and let them prove themselves within the democracy if we're going to be capable to rule and be part of partnership with the others in the government. And that's what we are trying to do in Iraq, for example. The other thing is to isolate the terrorists, as the situation is in Iraq right now. We are trying to get the people who were against the political process to be part of the political process and isolate the bad people. And then at the end, you will be left with some people who are not going to be abiding by any rules but their own rules. I think then the elimination process comes into the procedure that you have. At the end, you have to fight those who cannot be part of the modern world, the political process in any country. That's, I think, how, the issue of terrorism should be handled in places like Iraq or any other places.
So let me ask you, do you think that the participation of Hamas in the process in Palestine and even its victory, do you see that as a positive sign in isolating terrorism, or have terrorists been elevated to the leadership of the government?
To the contrary of many who believe that's a bad thing that happened in Palestine, I think it's a good thing that's happened in Palestine. We might end up seeing Hamas as the Likud of Palestine. Absolutely, because at one time people looked at Sharon and Likud in Israel in a way that they thought these people cannot be part of peace process. And at the end, Palestine ended up to deal with Likud and Sharon. At certain time, people called Fatah and Manazama Tahrir Palestinian, Palestinian Liberation Organization, they call them a terrorist organization. But then they became partnership in the peace process. I think, there is no other way but to get these people to be part of the political process. If you can solve your problems by involving them in the political process, it's better than, making them to be part of other things. And I think at the end, these people has to be practical. They have to provide solution for the problems that their countries are facing, the corruption that we see in many countries. This is why, Islamists are, winning in many of the countries, because they never been tried by their societies, and they always talk about how pure they are. Let us see how pure they are when you bring them into the political process. Many people lost the elections in many places because of the corruption. Fatah lost it, I think, because of the corruption. In Iraq, many people lost the election because of the corruption we had in Iraq. And that's why the Islamists, they keep talking about how pure they are. And let's see, probably they are pure people, and probably they can make progress. Or at the end, they will find out these people, they don't have a solution for their countries, and they become, as normal as other people in the political process.
Thank you very much. Gareth, you've been taking notes down there. Lots of challenges lined up, I'm sure. I want to open the floor pretty soon to the audience, but I first want to hear what you've got to say, Gareth.
Well, I'd rather be thought of by my colleagues as a contributor rather than a challenger. I think there's been
I think of you as
far
a challenger,
too much confrontation, accusation, far too little understanding of the issues united front, and that's what we're about trying to create. In that context, I'd like to react in particular to a couple of things that Faisal said about the PR dimension of this, and to suggest, while I agree with him in many respects, maybe Islamic countries and spokesmen could have done a bit better in 3 ways, and let me spell them out. The first is in the context of getting an agreed international definition of terrorism. I think that is tremendously important in the psychological war against terrorism. Let's put to one side the policing and the protective and the political strategies that are necessary to deal with this and just focus on the psychological dimension. You have to remove any vestige of a comfort zone around the concept of terrorism, either for the individuals engaged in it or for states who might be actively or passively supportive. And one way you can do that, which the international community tried last year but failed at the World Summit, is to get agreement on a core definition of terrorism that, in short, makes attacks on civilians, whatever the context, whether it's resistance to foreign occupation or in defence of the faith or whatever, absolutely forbidden, as prohibited as piracy and slavery became in the 19th century. The reluctance to do that was partly premised on your point about state terrorism. Why are you getting excited about this when you've got the continuing phenomenon of state terrorism? The point about state terrorism is very well dealt with by international humanitarian law. All the definitions are there as to what's prohibited. They've got to be better enforced. But what we don't have anywhere in the international system is a proper definition just dealing with assaults on civilians for political motives. And so long as that is lacking, and so long as it's lacking because all sorts of people are defending the right to kill civilians in various contexts, albeit limited, it's very, very difficult to create that psychological environment that is one of the preconditions to an effective assault on this. And I have to say that while the response on this issue is not confined to Islamic states or Islamic community leaders, it stretches more broadly across the developing world. A number of Islamic states have been in the forefront of those that have been making this argument against the adoption of a single definition of this kind. And so long as that stance continues, I don't frankly think that's very good PR in terms of advancing that part of the psychological war. The second thing, as has often been said, is the necessity for Muslim community leaders, clerics, scholars to get their own act together in terms of identifying and articulating just what is so comprehensively abhorrent about terrorism and articulating that in a way that will have some moral and institutional force. Now, the huge difficulty, of course, in the Muslim world is that you don't have institutional hierarchies in the religion, which makes it possible, if the hierarchy can get its act together, to deliver absolutely authoritative pronouncements across the board. We're all familiar with that issue. And it's also the case that informally, in that absence, many, many attempts have been made with an increasing degree of very welcome enthusiasm by scholars and clerics and community leaders to try and produce those alternative fatwas, if you like, or those pronouncements. But I think, frankly, more could be done on that front, while acknowledging the limitations of it. Our own work, the International Crisis Group in Southeast Asia, for example, has found very clearly that the nature of the terrorism that's being perpetrated by Salafi jihadists there is not going to be susceptible to pronouncements made by moderate clerics or scholars or community leaders. The only people they're going to listen to are individuals who have some legitimacy within the Salafi jihadist network itself. And so there's all sorts of constraints. I don't want to overstate the utility, but I think, frankly, more could be done. It's only just recently really started to be done, and I'd like to see that emphasis continue. The third and final point I'd like to make is I think more could be done by the Islamic community of scholars and clerics and policy makers just to sort of articulate how minority a taste this is this Salafi jihadist, this extreme violent activity. My own organisation produced a report about 18 months ago called Understanding Islamism, which has been the most downloaded and read report in the history of my organisation. And I'm a bit surprised that we sort of had to do it as a secular NGO rather than it coming from anywhere within the Islamic world, because what we did was very simply pull apart this phenomenon, distinguish first of all between Islam, the religion, and Islamism or Islamic activism, the active promotion or assertion of Islamic-based beliefs or prescriptions. And then within this Islamic activism, distinguish not only the Sunni versus Shiite strands of that and the different ideological intellectual foundations, but also within the more disconcerting Sunni brand of Islamic activism, we distinguish very clearly between the sort of the missionary brand, which is entirely sort of harmless in terms of the interests of the rest of the world, although it might be, sort of raise all sorts of issues about fundamentalism and so on, which get mixed up with the others. But the purely missionary brand that is purely an in-house debate within the Islamic community, to be distinguished in turn from the sort of the democratic political brands of Islamic activism, which don't have any sort of violence at their heart or core at all, but which are the heart and soul of many of the Islamic political movements that we're seeing emerge around the Middle East. And then finally, as a very, very small subset, a tiny subset of Islamic activism, those of a jihadist temperament, frame of mind, who turn their aspirations into violence. Now, that sort of understanding, I've been very simplistic about it, but that understanding of just how small this phenomenon is and how it does fit into the larger problem is, I think, a very important thing to get into the heads. Maybe it's a bit complicated to get into the heads of the wider community, but it certainly should be in the heads of policymakers. And I think there's been a degree of sort of failure to get that story across by you guys, which is part of the PR story that you have to be telling.
Thank you very much, Gareth, as a contributor. Now, we'd like contributions from the audience. Oh, no, Ragida, you're the first hand up. No, I was hoping I didn't see you before.
Thank you. Raghida Dargham Al-Haya, and I want to follow up on Mr. Hassani's points, very interesting points. Some see the result of elections in Iraq and in Palestine as a win for Iran. Obviously in Iraq because it's a Shiite power now, and in Palestine because Hamas is associated with Iran. So I'm wondering if you see it as a win for Iran, or is it more of a burden on Iran because it has to identify itself right now, especially with Hamas in power. I'm wondering what you think about this. And for Prince Turki, do you agree that right now the way to contain extremism is to incorporate it in the system so that it doesn't become terrorism? And what do you do with the United States when it says Hamas is a terrorist? Is there a role for countries like yours? Is there a role for the Arab world or for Europe to explain or to bridge the gap between the American position towards Hamas and the Arab position on Hamas? Thank you.
Mr. President?
Well, I think the election in Iraq was a win for Iraqis. It's not a win for Iran, absolutely not. The reason I say that, because this election is different than the election we had before. In the election of January 2005, it wasn't as inclusive as this election is. In this election, you have all the segments of the Iraqi society participated in this election, and that makes them partner within in governing the country. They're going to be in the parliament, they're going to be part of the government, so we are working to come up with a national unity government. When you talk about the principle of national unity government, then you are talking, how you can preserve the interest of Iraq. And I think in that regard, it would be very difficult for anyone to pull aside and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to serve the interest of another country. Nobody has the majority right now in the new parliament. So anything that has to do with the interest of another country has to go through the parliament. I might say there are major players in Iraq other than Iraqis themselves. the Iraqi politics today, it is not exclusive Iraqi politics. There are major players. Iran is a major player. United States is a major player. There are some regional countries. There are major players in Iraqi situation. So that's for other countries to be involved in Iraq because it is much bigger problem for Iraqis themselves to handle it. We need the support and the help of all the friends. So we don't, it doesn't matter to us, you know, that type of intervention, but we don't accept any other type of intervention that will hurt the interest of the Iraqis. So I think, you know, at the end, it is a win-win situation for Iraqis.
Your Highness, Mr. Ambassador, as Ambassador to Washington, are you going to be able to convince the Bush administration that it's a good thing Hamas is the majority in the Legislative Assembly?
Well, before answering that, I would just like to go back to what Mr. Evans said about our lacking in treating with the media and image problem. And I agree that Muslims have not been forthcoming nor loud enough in either responding to accusations or perhaps initiating condemnation and other things. But consistently, and from the point of view of Saudi Arabia and the practice of Saudi Arabia, from the early 60s when we have been targeted by terrorists, we have issued statement after statement from all levels, not just political and religious, but otherwise. But the Western media simply does not report it. If it was somebody like Abu Hamza in London saying thing, he's immediately on Sky, BBC, ITV, London Times, you name it. And so I think there is also the issue of what is, as was explained to me by a journalist friend that I made in London as ambassador there is the issue of sex appeal to deal with the press and selling the press. That takes precedence, in my view, over objective reporting in many Western media organs. So there is a blame also to be put on the Western media. Now, on the issue of Hamas and convincing the American administration, as I was walking in, I glanced at the television monitor that is outside, and there is a statement by Ms. Condoleezza Rice on the results of the elections in Palestine. As I understood what I briefly glanced at, it was that Ms. Rice and the United States government will have to deal with the choice of the Palestinian people, and that she will coordinate with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, on how to do that as a result of the elections. So I'm taking that as a sign that they are more realistic about the situation than perhaps they're given credit for. And I will refer back to what His Excellency, the President of the National Assembly in Iraq, Mr. Alhasani, said about the view of terrorism and so on, and his remark that Likud at one time was considered to be a terrorist organization. And it's true. Yani most of the Israeli leadership, if you take it from the time of Ben Gurion through the various prime ministers and so on, Begin, even Rabin, and even Shimon Peres and so on, from the eyes of the Palestinians, they were pretty much a terrorist group that took over their land, killed their people, drove them out of their homeland, and simply devastated their lives. And yet, they dealt with them. And it's true that the PLO and then Fatah and so on were identified by the Israelis as terrorist organizations, and yet the Israelis have negotiated with the PLO and Fatah and so on. So things are never static in politics, and movements come and go. Hamas, now that it's taken responsibility, will have to show that it is a responsible leader that safeguards the interests of the Palestinian people in general, and not simply their supporters on the ground. So they have to bring in those from the other factions in Palestinian society and regard them as fellow Palestinians whose rights and whose aspirations must be protected as well as their own.
Thank you very much. I think, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to say a comment both about His Highness's remark and also what Gareth pointed about psychology and the media. But also, I think we need to remember that many people around the world are governed by fear today. America is afraid of another 9/11. American Jews are afraid of another Holocaust. The governments in the Arab world are afraid of what happens if America is successful because they're calling for regime change in a number of neighboring countries. Now there's also a fear what happens if the United States pulls up very quickly because of the pressure on the US government right now, because of the coming elections this November, people calling for the withdrawal of troops, that if they withdraw troops prematurely, that Iraq may be an incubator for terrorism. These are the things that I'm hearing from different sides. There's a very strong element of fear. There was a fear in Iran when I was on a part of a US delegation there a year and a half ago about the lack of a desire by the US administration to try and have a coherent policy towards the region. So when you see and hear the language of we want regime change in Iran, we want regime change in Syria, we want regime change in Saudi Arabia, we want regime change here, fear governs people, and if people are afraid, they'll be governed by that fear. And the language of fear has just heightened, so that we see increasing things happening today. It's happening in London. It just happened in Bangladesh, the first suicide bombers in Bangladesh a few months ago. It's happening today in Holland. It's happening in Sweden. It's happening increasingly. People are afraid, Chris, and we have to address people's need to feel comfortable and safe. And I don't think we've addressed it. And in many of the ways in which we're addressing it that way, we see, or whatever has been done hasn't been working. We're not dealing with the perceptions that people have that there is a genuineness on each side.
You're saying that people are afraid of Muslims who are involved with terrorism, is that, or you're saying
there's a general
works both
fear.
ways?
Muslim leaders are afraid that if they come out with certain statements, they will lose their positions or they hold their communities. There's fear in every quarter.
Well, the thing that's always struck me as I read Al-Qaeda's literature, if you can call it that, and the arguments made by the jihadists, is the constant refrain that Islam is under siege.
Yes.
Our people are under siege. We are attacked. We are attacked by Hindus in India, by Jews in Palestine, by Americans in Iraq. We are under attack everywhere you look. And it is because we're under attack that we have to do whatever it is we do to retaliate. I mean, the whole justification of Al-Qaeda, strung out over many, many documents, for killing civilians is, this is the only tool that's left to us. And I don't know how to address that.
If you go anywhere in the Muslim world, you ask people, what is the war on terror about? You'll find 70 to 80% educated people will tell you the war on terror is a disguised war against Islam. I was part of a BBC debate with Tim Sebastian, and we were expected to lose the debate, actually. A debate on this very issue. And we were told this was the percentage by which this perception is held. So the battlefront is a battlefront of perceptions. And if we don't win the game on perceptions among leaders as well as the grassroots, we will lose the war.
Yes, Johannes.
Just to complement what the Sheikh said about perceptions and so on. In America, I think there are statistics that show that most Americans are afraid of Islam. So it's a two-way street, in as much as we Muslims regard America and the West as responsible for much of the ills that have befallen us. Also in the West, particularly after September 11th, and I think in America particularly, as the Sheikh said, they have a fear about September 11th being repeated, and that fear is translated into identifying that act with Muslims. And so the stereotyping happens both ways, I think, and we have to take that into account.
Yeah. Microphone? Now don't read a long statement here.
No.
I see that pad in front of you.
2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Let me look at it from different perspective. Why don't we call Islam and Muslim are the source of modernity, the source of civilization, and the source of leadership, which the world is waiting to see. We need to be seen as leading partner of humanity and the global leading partner of humanity. This is what Islam was about when it came as a religion to save humanity 1400 years ago. The feeling now from the discussion going on that we are dissecting Muslim, anatomically dissecting Muslim and Islam, and putting them in a corner and showing them that they are extremists, they are terrorists, and they are fundamentalists because they need to be learned what is modernity is about. And when we look at the basis and the ethics of the new civilization we're enjoying in Europe now, in the West, it came from Cordoba, it came from Turkey, it came from Egypt, it came from Iraq, and came from Syria. This continuation of civilization is what we need to discuss to eliminate any source of extremism. The second statement, which I'm going to make it in less than 1 minute, it is extremism. Extremism reflects incompetent leadership, which lead to social injustice, as well as bad foreign policy. We are watching this worldwide, globally, and we don't talk about incompetent leadership, but we talk about clergy in the mosque, Imam in the mosque, actually, and masses who could become frustrated. What we need to look at comprehensively and globally on the incompetent leadership, which lead to social injustice, as well as bad foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Down over here? Yeah, well, we'll go here and here. Trudy?
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'd like to ask Hajim Alhasani and Prince Turki the following. Mr. Hassani said that in a democracy, if religious parties are elected, they should play by the rules. What happens if Hamas is not willing to subscribe to the rules, or if it plays a Northern Ireland game where it is Sinn Féin, but the military wing still keeps fighting? Would then the Arab world say publicly that democratic parties must play by the rules, or would they criticize Israel if Israel said, we won't deal with a party or negotiate with a party that won't play by democratic rules?
Well, I think it's, in the first place, it's not just Hamas should play with the rules, it's everybody. When Palestinian election was happening, there wasn't a rule saying that Hamas should not participate in the election. Nobody said that. So the rule was that everybody can participate in that election. And then we have to accept the results of that election. And I think this is what the Secretary of State's Rice today mentioned in this way or another way, that the result, the election was a democratic election, and at the end we have to accept that result. Then there comes the issue if the winner doesn't play with the rules, you know, international rules or regional rules. There's also rules to deal with that. You know, if you don't become part or a player within the team, then and nobody's going to play with you. You become again isolated from the regional powers. You will be isolated from international powers. Nobody will be dealing with you. I think the ideology of isolating any group gives them strength more than, you know, they have. What we should do, bring them in, let them be part of the international society. I want to mention one point here. Today, everybody would like to deal with people probably like me and others when they come to Iraq, many thinkers in the United States or in the West, when they come to Iraq, they come to meet people like us who understand the relationship between the West and the East. I think they need to go and meet other people whom we have problem with them, that they don't understand this type of relationship. They need to go in Iraq and meet people who are standing against democracy in Iraq, who are against the political process. So they do that, I think they're going to find some common ground between themselves. We go to the United States, we talk everywhere with everybody, but nobody invites the other to go over there and have this type of relationship. I think open community relationship with the Muslim society will help everybody and will help the Muslim countries to realize that democracy will help them rather than hurting them. Thank you.
Iqbal, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, I think the point I wanted to stress was the whole issue about double standards. When we look into the whole concept of extremism, and time and again, it's referred as to what really moves that balance from that mainstream understanding to an understanding that you feel you are besieged or you are marginalized. And I think the international community needs to be aware of that. Because if we start looking right from the top at the UN level, with the various UN resolutions that have been passed over the years, in terms of its implementation, a simple point about occupation, there are UN resolutions there. And the persons on the ground, whether he's a Muslim or anybody, questions that if there are UN resolutions that can be implemented so swiftly, for example, the occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, immediate implementation by the world community, result was done. People are questioning that there's still continuation of occupation, for example, in lands in Palestine. Absolutely nothing happening into it. When we deal about how United States deal with Korea, North Korea at the moment, on the whole issue of nuclear, it's prepared to give undertakings of no regime change or, for example, strikes into it. Are they dealing with the similar basis with other countries that are at the moment seen as a threat? When we look at the definition of terrorism, and does it apply across to all the states, organizations, and individuals? That consistency is so important because today in the globalized world, a young person at this greater level of education coming, they're looking, they're reading, they're seeing what's happening. And when they see that, look, why is this unfairness? Why can't certain things be done, which is unjust? It's unfair. Yet when we see the world opinion immediately coming up, so classical case is the word Islamic extremist and Islamic terrorism. This really comes from, no way would one hear about Christian terrorism when the whole national agenda in Ireland was fought, or for that matter, in any other part of the world. There is this continuous denigration that comes up, and somehow it is felt by the communities. And of course, we must take the responsibility to take it up. And I think more and more people are able to understand. Just the word Islamic extremist or Islamic terrorism, when this was being pronounced time and again through the BBC, we took the initiative of meeting the BBC and explaining to them as to the amount of damage it is causing and how sort of unfair and unjust it is. They were able to change that policy. The government, we went to the government, and then, of course, the government departments said it's not right and proper for us to use the word Islamic terrorist.
Point taken, but I sometimes wonder myself why more Muslim voices are not raised that don't say Osama bin Laden is not a Muslim. Osama bin Laden claims all the time to speak for Islam, and he gets away with it partly because Islam as such doesn't reject him. They say, well, there's some of those things he does, that's not such good things. But then he's got a point here about this thing and that thing. He had a point about blowing up 3,000 people on a Tuesday morning in New York. Maybe he had an ideological point to make, but is that Muslim practice?
Well,
and if it's not, why is he not flatly rejected?
Well, one thing is very clear, whether...
That was actually rhetorical.
Sure, but it's just a particular point about whether one is Islamic teaching and one whether it's Pastor Laman. In terms of Islamic teaching is concerned, I think that's absolutely clear, it's explicit, there's no two answers about it. But whether one is a Muslim or not, that of course it remains, it's not between him, it's between him and the Creator, and how one can denounce or castigate that.
I have to respond to that one.
Okay.
I mean, after 9/11, every Muslim...
I'm sorry, we've run out of time.
Every Muslim nation condemned the act of 9/11. All Muslim leaders condemned the act of 9/11.
Actually, Iraq did not condemn it.
Part of the frustration that we have in the Muslim world is that you know what, we have this feeling, Chris, that no matter how hard we speak, as His Highness said, we are not heard and our voices are not amplified. As Rabbi Mark Gelban said, if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. That is our challenge. Yes, we are challenged. Yes, we have to do more. We all admit that. But unless there is a cooperation with the Western media in helping amplify those of us who have condemned and not keep telling us, not condemning us, it will make our task much easier.
I'm getting a signal here that I'm supposed to wrap this up. In fact, our time is over. I'm happy to go on for as long as anybody wants to go on, and there are a lot of hands up here, but we may need to clear out this room, as a matter of fact, so we can take it all into the hallway, I guess. Thank you very much for coming.